I leapt down from the high ledge, bending my knees like a spring as my feet touched the cobbled streets below. I then dropped into a ready crouch in the shadows of a low hedge, just an arm's span from the ledge whence I came. To my left, upon a glance, I saw Denner, also crouched, just a few yards from my position. I met his gaze, his dark eyes, the only thing visible upon his visage. There was something about those jade eyes of his, something beautiful, yet dark, deep, something mysterious. He nodded, and I couldn't see it, but I knew he was grinning at me. I surveyed the scene for a time, watching and listening. We were at the very edge of the gardens, having just come down from the towering tall houses, which we, before that, had descended from the even loftier corridors of the sky path, very high above us now. It was just past the 11th hour, so we had about an hour before. The Hewlern's traditional selection went into play. Every year, the Hewlern's annual ball attendees would be subjected to what I thought was the most heinous and embarrassing, not to mention rude, selection process to choose the guests who would get to remain for the second half of the ball. It was a disgusting display of flesh market, where the female guests would take turns walking down the center of the room, in nothing but their undergarments, or nude if they chose to, with sticks of smooth polished wood, like wands, held out in front of them, and the men would throw rings of gold, about 4 inches in diameter, at the women. Then it was up to the women to catch the rings on their wands. The woman with the most rings on her wand, after each round, was the winner for that round. The one with the least, the loser. The winner would be led to a special area, with posh love seats, chairs, and little round tables, like a lounge, where they were waited on hand and foot by servants who were responsible for making them feel as comfortable as possible. Until the selection was over, the loser was asked to go home. Each round, and one after another, the sad, teary-eyed women would be led out of the mansion, stuffed into a carriage, and driven home, unable to experience the debauchery soon to come. The smart ones, the ones with the most desirable curves, and the best manicured privates were totally nude. This would ensure that the men tossed their rings lightly, with no spin, so they would be relatively easy to catch. The selection process ended when there were no more women left to compete. Once the selection was over, the remaining women were allowed to leave the selection lounge, to join the men who had passed the night's previous tests, and were able to avoid being sent home by one of the women assigned to call them from the guests. The whole process was just disgusting to me. Don't get me wrongly, I am a very sexual person, or at least I was, at one time. And even though it had been a long time since I'd been vulnerable enough to allow a man to bed me, I love sex. I even had my fair share of sexual fetishes that were more deviant than some other women, one could say. But one of them was not being made an object of purely sexual desire, or being paraded about like my body was the only thing of value that I had. At any rate, the stories of the Hewlern and his sexual deviancy were legendary, and the selection process at his annual ball was probably the very least of the worst of them. I remained where I was, for a time, noting any pattern or roots I could make out. Amongst the sentries I could see moving through the gardens, were at any other time, and for any other purpose. Those gardens were beautiful, and sprawled in a vast area with tiled walkways, snaking through, connecting copses of glow balls, lighted with a lavender hue, about a rock toss apart, many of them, all throughout the entire garden, like small treasure troves of light, each with their own nexus of flowers of all different types. I could smell the pleasant aroma of the flowers strongly, but not overly so. It was very fine. Another scent, that of opium, was wafting through the gardens as the Hewlern had small sconces, hanging from the trees, at regular intervals throughout, burning balls of the narcotic drug, spreading the sweet, floral scent to mix with the natural scents of the flowers. For a moment, I was worried that the opium smoke may hinder my ability to effectively perform my task, but I put the thought from my mind. It was unlikely that the Hulearn was trying to drug his guests to the point of inebriation. I did notice that I felt calmer than normal, even though I had very good control over my external reactions to stimuli, and always managed to stay calm in most every situation. But I felt the effects of the opium for certain, and I liked it. I felt perfectly warm, not cold or hot, and my mind was still as clear as it always was. In fact, I believe that the opium caused a heightened awareness in my perceptual abilities, for it was very easy for me to pinpoint things with my vision, and my hearing was also very sensitive, almost as if the opium had increased my perception to magical levels. The latent thought that magic may also be at play in these gardens crossed my mind also. I shook my head. Stay focused, OWLIE. The suns above Toril had just begun to sink behind the curve of the horizon, leaving a hazy violet-orange glow behind them, which slipped through the leaves of the trees above me. It cast the garden in a warm light, causing my thoughts to calm. I refocused my mind to the task at hand, and moving my view towards a copse of cypress trees about a bowshot ahead of me. I then allowed my analytical mind to map out the fastest, stealthiest, and least obstructed route to reach them. 2 sentries strolled lackadaisically through the gardens, slowly moving through the hedgerows, one of whom was about a rock toss to my left, and the other about a stone's throw ahead of me and slightly to the right. I could see a route that would take me past them without detection. With a glance towards Denner, I signed, follow, close, evade, and regroup. At Big Rock, near trees, he nodded, his beautiful jade eyes glinting with what I could only guess was excitement. He truly did seem to have an affinity for danger and adventure. I loved that about him. It was an affinity we shared, though he seemed far more prepared for it than I. I slipped off, moving quickly and silently through the gardens, slinking into the shadows that the trees provided, melding into them, moving entirely unseen towards the cypress trees. I passed the first guard, about a rock toss to his right, completely undetected by the lazy, heavy-lidded man. It would seem the opium smoke in the gardens had taken a little toll on that one. I smirked. The Hulearn really needed to improve the training of his elite guardsmen. If they couldn't even guard his home, how would they guard his life? Moving past the guard now, I came to a hedgerow that stood almost as tall as I, with brambles and thorns jutting out of its thick leaves like spikes. I saw the solution before I even had to try, and without further thought, I took 2 running steps, jumped into the air, pushing off a nearby tree stump, and vaulted myself over the hedge silently. Arching my back and lifting my arms above my head, like a gymnast, I slipped over the hedge, doing a half backflip, my hands touching the ground first. Then I rolled into my momentum, coming to a ready crouch about as far from the hedge as I could spit. I paused then, scanning my surroundings with a professional habit, to ensure that I remained unseen or heard. Of course, I already knew that nobody had noticed me, but I was glad that I had paused then to take a surveying of my surroundings. Professional habit was, as always, a smart way to do things, and the proof of this just so happened to come strolling out from behind a nearby tree, buttoning up the flap of his breeches, having obviously just relieved himself there. He wore the same livery as the other guards, but the insignia of the captain of the guard held his purple cloak about his shoulders, and a beautifully crafted long sword swung from his hip. He had a similar lazy, nonchalant gait of the men under his command, though the alertness and readiness in his eyes was far more prominent. He was but a few paces from where I sat crouched, and I slowly moved, as quietly as I could, back, deeper into the shadows. My hand went naturally to the hilt of one of my boot knives, as I prepared to draw and throw it if I had to. The captain paused, then inclined his chin, as if he may have heard something nearby, his hand going reflexively to the hilt of his sword. Off to my right, I heard the faint sound of something scuffling in the underbrush. The captain, it seemed, had also heard it, and moved slowly, yet purposefully, off to investigate the noise. Another sound, this time a crashing of feet through the brush, came to my ears. Then, moving away from my position rapidly, the captain clenched his fist around the sword hilt now, his gloved hands creaking with his grip.
Hoi, who goes there?
said he, stopping all movement and spreading his feet into a ready stance, bending his knees.
Do not be a fool and try and hide from me. I will find you. And when I do, you will have been not as smart for trying to hide from me.
And being convinced that he either heard someone there, or simply believed someone to be there, he drew his long sword.
I'll give you this last warning, fool. If you do not present yourself now, and lay down any arms you may have, then explain your purpose. I will chase and have at you. Believe me when I say, you do not want for me to catch you, once you have made me go through the trouble. Do you hear me, foolish rogue?
But there came no answer. It was all silent once again. I waited, and so did the captain, his sword still drawn, still ready and waiting for something to occur. Then, off to my left, but behind the captain now, came a thrashing of brush, as if someone had fallen, and then distinct footsteps, running away from us, towards the mansion itself. Without delay, the captain turned and ran after the noise, sword in hand, crashing through the brush. And then, I could no longer see him, for he had gone out of my field of vision. I could hear him cracking tree limbs, and cursing aloud as he ran through what must have been one of the many thorny rose bushes in the gardens. But then all sound ceased, and I only waited for another few breaths, before I took advantage of the distraction, to make my way towards the cypress trees, which were now just a stone's throw away.